All right, let's just jump right in. We're going to tackle one of the biggest, most fundamental questions you can possibly ask. And we're going to use the incredible work of biologist Ernst Mayr as our guide. The question is simple. What is life? But as you'll see, biology's answer is anything but simple, and it's incredibly powerful.
You know, this isn't some newfangled scientific question. It's ancient. Think about it. Our earliest ancestors, living their lives surrounded by the cycles of nature, they looked at a bird in the sky and a rock on the ground and must have wondered, what is the actual difference here? This is one of the oldest human mysteries there is.
So the first real scientific crack at solving this puzzle, well, it didn't come from biology at all. It came from physics and from a revolutionary new way of thinking that pictured the entire universe as one giant, intricate, and ultimately predictable machine. Yeah, during the Renaissance, people became obsessed with clocks and automatons, and this led thinkers like Descartes to a pretty radical idea. What if living things, animals, plants, even us, are just really, really complex machines? This view is called mechanism or physicalism, and the thinking was, if you could just take life apart, understand all its little gears and levers and chemicals, you could explain the whole thing. Life wasn't some deep mystery. It was just a complicated clock. And Galileo, well, he summed up this whole mindset perfectly. If the universe and everything in it is written in the language of math, then everything, including life, should be totally predictable. All you need are the right equations and the starting conditions, and you should be able to figure out everything that happens next.
But there was a problem. As elegant as this life as a machine idea was, it just couldn't explain some really basic things about being alive. And this failure gave rise to a powerful counter-argument. It started to feel like there was, well, a ghost in the machine. And that counter-argument was called vitalism. Vitalists said, look, you can dissect a frog all you want, you can list every chemical and every bone, but you will never find the thing that makes it alive. They believed that living things were animated by some kind of special, non-physical vital force, a life spark that you just couldn't measure or explain, and that it left the body when an organism died. Now, this wasn't just some abstract debate. A crucial experiment seemed to blow the mechanical theory right out of the water. In the 1880s, a scientist named Hans Driesch, who was a die-hard mechanist, did something simple but profound. He took a tiny sea urchin embryo, right after it had divided into two cells, and he gently separated them. Now, the machine theory predicted a clear result. He should get two halves of a sea urchin. But that's not what happened. Instead, he got two smaller but absolutely perfect whole larvae. It was as if some invisible blueprint guided each cell to build the entire organism. Driesch was so shaken by this result that he completely abandoned his old beliefs and became one of the most passionate vitalists out there.
So you see, for centuries, this was the big fight. On one side, you had the mechanists, saying life is nothing more than the sum of its physical parts, completely predictable if you know enough. And on the other, the vitalists, saying life is animated by a mysterious, non-physical spark. It really felt like you had to choose a side. But then, modern biology came along, and according to Ernst Mayr, biology's great insight was that both sides of this argument were wrong. It wasn't about picking a side, it was about realizing there was a third option, a completely new way of thinking that was so much more powerful than either mechanism or vitalism. The first game-changing concept is emergence. This is the idea that when you put simple things together, totally new and unpredictable properties can just emerge, properties that weren't there in the individual parts at all. The vitalists were right about one thing. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, but they were wrong about why. It's not some mystical force, it's a natural property of complex systems. Let me give you a really simple example that makes this click. Take hydrogen, a gas that's highly explosive, and take oxygen, a gas that fire needs to burn. If you studied them separately forever, you would never ever predict that putting them together would create water, H2O, a liquid that has the completely new emergent property of putting fires out. Life is just like that, but on a scale of complexity that's almost impossible to imagine. Okay, the second big idea from biology is maybe even more radical. For thousands of years, thanks to Plato, Western thought was built on something called essentialism. That's the idea that for everything, there's a perfect, ideal type or essence, a perfect chair, a perfect dog, and the real things we see are just flawed copies.
Biology flips that completely on its head. It says, no, 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 those little variations and imperfections, they aren't flaws. That variation is the reality. And this new perspective is called population thinking.
Mayr told this great story about trying to explain this to the genius physicist Wolfgang Pauli. To get the idea across, he came up with this analogy. He said, okay, imagine a gas, but don't think of it like a physicist, where every molecule is basically identical. Imagine an individual gas, where every single molecule is unique. It has its own specific speed, its own unique direction. In biology, that uniqueness, that individual variation is what really matters. That's population thinking.
So what happens when you combine these two ideas, emergence and population thinking? Well, you realize that biology can't just work like physics, which is always searching for timeless universal laws that apply everywhere. No, biology often has to work more like a detective or a historian. To get a full picture of anything in the living world, a biologist has to ask 3 different kinds of questions. First, what? That's just describing what you see. Then, how? That's about the immediate mechanics. How does a nerve fire? How does a muscle contract? But the deepest and most unique question biology asks is why. And this isn't about some grand purpose. It's about the ultimate cause. What's the evolutionary history that led to this thing existing in the first place? And here's the kicker. Because evolution is a story made up of unique, one-time events, you can't create a universal law of giraffes having long necks. It only happened once. So to answer the why question, you have to do what Mayr called constructing a historical narrative. You have to piece together all the evidence you can find to build a plausible story of how things came to be, just like a detective trying to solve a cold case. The extinction of the dinosaurs is the perfect example of this in action. For decades, scientists had all these narratives. Maybe it was a disease, maybe climate change, but the evidence was pretty weak. Then, in 1980, a new historical narrative was put on the table. A giant meteor smashed into the Earth. Now, this story made a testable prediction. If that's true, there has to be a giant crater somewhere from that time period. And guess what? They found it in the Yucatan Peninsula. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't just a guess, it became the best explanation for this totally unique event in the history of life. Okay, so why does any of this matter to you and me? Because this way of thinking about emergence, uniqueness, and history doesn't just apply to sea urchins and dinosaurs. It completely changes how we understand ourselves. Mayr argues that the classic Greek advice, know thyself, gets a massive upgrade from biology. You can't really know who we are as individuals or as a species without understanding the long, messy, contingent historical narrative of our own evolution. And this leads to maybe the most profound takeaway of all. When you look at it from a biological perspective, our sense of right and wrong, our ability to cooperate, our entire capacity for ethics, it's not some supernatural gift dropped down from the heavens. It's an emergent property. It's a trait that evolved over millions of years, right alongside walking on 2 legs, because it helped our social ancestors survive. And that brings us to the final critical point. Biology doesn't hand us a moral rule book. It doesn't tell us what we should do. What it does is reveal the astonishing fact that we are the products of a historical process that gave us the very ability to think about such things. You could say evolution gave us the hardware for ethical thought. The question that Mayr leaves us with is, what software are we going to choose to run on it?